Consistency isn't hard because you're lazy. It's hard because your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do: conserving energy wherever possible, resisting unnecessary repetition of effortful tasks, and orienting toward novelty over routine. Because novelty, evolutionarily, is where new information and new opportunity tend to live. Every consistency strategy that's ever been sold to you as a matter of trying harder was fighting directly against that basic biology, using tools designed for a completely different problem. The strategies that actually hold up under research do something else entirely. They stop fighting the biology and start building around it. It's why your brain resists repetition by default. Start with the underlying neuroscience of what a new behavior actually requires from the brain the first time you do it. Any unfamiliar action, an unfamiliar route, an unfamiliar sequence of movements, an unfamiliar decision, requires active engagement of the brain's more effortful, resource-intensive processing systems, the ones involved in deliberate attention and conscious decision-making. This processing is metabolically expensive, and the brain, shaped over a very long evolutionary history in environments where energy was frequently scarce, is built with a strong general bias toward minimizing unnecessary expenditure of exactly this kind of costly processing. This is where a foundational principle of neuroscience becomes directly relevant. Psychologist Donald Hebb's early theoretical work on neural learning, later summarized in the frequently cited shorthand, "Neurons that fire together, wire together," described how repeated co-activation of the same neural pathways strengthens the connections between them, making that specific sequence of activation progressively easier and more automatic to trigger again. This is the actual mechanism underlying what gets casually called habit formation. It isn't a metaphor. Repetition of a specific behavior in a specific context measurably strengthens the neural pathway associated with it, gradually shifting execution of that behavior from the effortful, energy-expensive, deliberate system into a faster, cheaper, more automatic one that no longer requires the same conscious overhead to run. This reframes the entire problem. The reason a new consistent behavior feels so disproportionately hard in the first weeks isn't a failure of character. It's the literal physical cost of running a pathway that hasn't yet been strengthened, using the brain's more expensive processing system by necessity, because the cheaper automatic pathway simply doesn't exist yet, and it reframes why that same behavior gets dramatically easier later. Not because you developed more discipline, but because the underlying neural pathway has been physically strengthened through repetition, to the point where it no longer requires the expensive system to execute at all. Motivation was never going to be a reliable delivery mechanism. Here's the practical implication that most consistency advice gets backward. If the actual mechanism of consistency is pathway strengthening through repetition, and that process is largely independent of how motivated you feel on any given day, then a strategy built entirely around sustaining motivation was never actually targeting the right variable. Motivation is, by design, a state, not a trait, fluctuating with sleep, stress, mood, blood sugar, weather, and dozens of other variables that have nothing to do with how much you actually want the underlying outcome. Building a consistency plan that depends on motivation remaining high enough every single day to override the brain's default resistance to unfamiliar effort is building a plan with a known structural point of failure baked directly into its design. It isn't a question of whether that plan eventually breaks down on a low motivation day. It's a question of when. Psychologist Wendy Wood's research on habit formation, covered in more depth elsewhere on this channel, offers the actual working alternative. Her research found that once a behavior becomes sufficiently linked to a stable environmental cue, a specific time, a specific location, a specific preceding action, that cue itself can trigger the behavior with minimal reliance on in-the-moment motivation at all. This is the practical payoff of the Hebbian mechanism described above. A strengthened neural pathway doesn't need to be talked into firing. It fires because the associated cue is present, largely bypassing the motivational negotiation that a non-habitual behavior requires every single time. Why identity-level framing outperforms outcome-level framing. There's a second lever worth understanding, because it interacts directly with the mechanism above, rather than operating separately from it. A substantial body of research on self-perception and behavior has found that how a goal gets linguistically framed measurably affects follow-through. And the direction of the effect is specific and consistent. One of the clearest demonstrations comes from research by psychologists Christopher Bryan, Gregory Walton, Todd Rogers, and Carol Dweck, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, examining voter turnout. Their studies found that framing participation around identity, asking people how important it is to be a voter, using the noun, produced significantly higher actual voting turnout than framing the identical request around action, asking how important it is to vote using the verb. The specific linguistic shift from an action you perform to an identity you hold was sufficient on its own to move measurable real-world behavior. And the effect has been examined across several related studies since. The likely mechanism connects back to the same repetition-based system described earlier. An outcome-based goal, I want to lose weight, is evaluated afresh and can be judged as failed or unnecessary on any single day that doesn't move the outcome forward, which gives the brain's motivation-dependent system constant openings to negotiate an exception. An identity-based framing, I am someone who exercises, isn't evaluated against a single day's outcome. It's evaluated against a broader, more stable self-concept, one that once a person has started to internalize it, tends to generate the behavior as a matter of consistency with self-image, rather than as a fresh decision requiring fresh motivation each time. This doesn't bypass the neural pathway strengthening process described earlier. It reinforces it by reducing the number of moments where the behavior is genuinely up for renegotiation instead of simply executing along an already reinforced pathway. Why Mondays actually work, even though they shouldn't. There's a specific, well-documented psychological phenomenon that offers a further practical lever, and it initially seems to contradict the emphasis on stable, unremarkable repetition described above. Researchers Hengchen Dai, Katherine Milkman, and Jason Riis, examining large-scale behavioral data including gym attendance, online searches for goal-related terms, and financial commitment behaviors, identified what they termed the fresh start effect. Their research found that temporal landmarks, the start of a new week, a new month, a new year, a birthday, reliably increase people's motivation to pursue goals and initiate new behaviors. More than equivalent, arbitrarily chosen days do. The mechanism their research points to is psychological distancing. A temporal landmark creates a subjective sense of separation from a previous, less successful version of yourself, allowing the new attempt to feel like a genuinely fresh start, rather than merely another attempt layered on top of an accumulating history of prior failures. This matters as a practical tool specifically because it interacts productively with the identity-based framing described above. A fresh start doesn't just provide a motivational boost on day one. Used well, it provides a natural moment to explicitly install a new identity-based frame. This is the week I became someone who does this. Right at the exact psychological moment, the research shows people are most receptive to that kind of self-redefinition. Building a system that doesn't depend on how you feel. Put together, these findings point toward a genuinely different kind of consistency strategy than the ones built around willpower and daily resolve. The neural pathway strengthening research suggests the actual mechanism of consistency is repetition under stable, specific conditions, not sustained daily motivation. Wood's research on environmental cues suggests those stable conditions should be deliberately engineered into the environment itself, rather than relying on remembering or deciding fresh each day. The identity framing research suggests the goal itself should be described in terms of who you are, rather than what you're trying to achieve, reducing the number of moments where the behavior is genuinely up for debate. And the fresh start research suggests the beginning of the attempt should be deliberately anchored to a meaningful temporal landmark, harnessing a real documented motivational boost. Rather than starting on an arbitrary Tuesday with no psychological scaffolding attached to it at all. None of this removes effort from the process entirely, particularly at the beginning, before the relevant neural pathway has had time to strengthen through repetition, but it relocates where that effort needs to be spent, not into daily, renewable resolve, but into the initial one-time work of designing an environment a cue and a self-framing that will keep generating the behavior largely on their own, once the underlying pathway has had enough repetition to strengthen. So the failure was never really about how much willpower you were able to summon on a hard day. It was about building a system that required willpower to be summoned fresh on every single hard day, indefinitely, when the actual biological mechanism of consistency was working towards something else the entire time. A strengthened pathway that once built was never going to need your motivation to ask permission again. You weren't failing at consistency, you were asking the wrong system to run it.